So today we're going to discuss two theories, the thermodynamic dissipation theory for the origin of life, which we have been talking about throughout this course, and the other, let's say, more famous theory, which is the hydrothermal vent theory or hypothesis for the origin of life. So now we know that the thermodynamic dissipation theory of the origin of life says that life started on the ocean surface under a strong flux of UVC light. And it in fact was this UVC light which was necessary for its dissipative structuring. And its dissipative structuring in such a manner to allow the dissipation of this light. So there is a metabolism involved, which is the production of these molecules or these pigments in the UVC. But more importantly than that, there's a dissipation involved that once these pigments are created, they act like little dissipators, like little hurricanes to dissipate the UVC light, and that is their function. The other theory then is the hydrothermal vent theory of the origin of life, which says that life started at the bottom of the oceans, at mid-ocean ridges, where material is coming up from the mantle and causing the seafloor to spread. And at these positions, there are these vents in which hot water are coming out at very high temperatures between, let's say, 100 and about 300 degrees centigrade. And they contain a lot of minerals. And they also have a variation of pH values. So we considered that the ocean water at the time of the origin of life had about a pH of about 6.5 because there was a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this would have been dissolved into the surface water. And when you get close to these hydrothermal vents, the pH increases, that is, they become more alkaline. And so we have a gradient of pH and a gradient of temperature also, and we have very high pressures. So let me just give a short comparison of the characteristics of the two different theories. For the thermodynamic dissipation theory of the origin of life, we assume that life started somewhere on the ocean surface. And for the hydrothermal vent theory, at the bottom of the ocean. So the area available for the origin of life in the TDT theory is the whole Earth's surface, essentially because the oceans at that time covered almost all of Earth's surface. There was very few continents or very small amount of landmass. Whereas with the hydrothermal vent theory, the origin, the area of the location would have been restricted to isolated hotspots. And we'll see that they are in fact very few and isolated, at least today. There may have been more at the origin of life, but at least today they're very few and isolated. So there was not much area for origin of life within the perspective of the hydrothermal vent theory. Now, the light we require for the thermodynamic dissipation theory to be very strong in the ultraviolet and the UVC, in particular, the long wavelength part of the UVC. For the hydrothermal vent theory, there is no light because you're at the bottom of the ocean. You're more than 4 or 5 kilometers deep in the ocean and no light is arriving. Light basically arrives about to 100 meters depth of the oceans. And then at that point, there's very little light, only blue light, which has the least absorption coefficient in ocean water. And the temperatures were about approximately the same. We assumed that we had high temperatures, about 85 degrees centigrade, near to the denaturing temperature of DNA, because of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And also with the hydrothermal vent theories, where we have these vents which are gushing out hot water at different temperatures that can range from about 100 to 350 degrees centigrade. So as I mentioned, the pH of the ocean waters was more acidic than it is today. We estimate about 6.5 because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And with the hydrothermal vent theories, we have a range of pH values. That's good. We can have from about 6.5 to 9.5, depending on how close you are to these hydrothermal vents. The mechanism for the synthesis of the molecules, in our case, is photochemical, whereas in the hydrothermal vent theory, it's known as Fischer-Tropsch. And I'll explain what is Fischer-Tropsch in the following slides, but basically it has to do with pressure and temperature. Pressures being very great, maybe as great as 1,000 atmospheres at those depths. And at these temperatures, as I mentioned, which are coming out of the hydrothermal vents. So the free energy then for the synthesis was UVC light in our theory, and it was gradients of temperature, pressure, or pH in the hydrothermal vent theory. As catalysts in our theory, we can use the ocean surface. It has been found rather recently that the surface is a very good catalyst, acts as a very good catalyst, and organics. Also, we have organic catalysts. They're not necessarily all inorganic. Whereas in the hydrothermal vent theory, there would be inorganic minerals, different metals, for example. And with respect to the function, well, in our case, life or the origin of life did indeed facilitate a particular function, which is basic in nature, and that is dissipation. As we know that all irreversible processes require dissipation to occur. And in fact, those irreversible processes, you can say, are the result of dissipation, where dissipation is the spread of the conserved quantities over ever more degrees of freedom, microscopic degrees of freedom. In the case of the hydrothermal vent theory, well, there is no function assumed for the origin of life. It was basically an accident, and it's basically living for itself, or trying to live for itself, and defending off the others in a competition. So a little bit like the Darwinian theory. So our theory I presented in 2009, and the hydrothermal vent theory were presented by these authors in 1981, when they discovered these hydrothermal vents for the first time at the bottom of these oceans. And the same people that discovered these hydrothermal vents also proposed the theory of the origin of life at these hydrothermal vents. But it was really a person who is called Michael Russell, who is considered the father of the origin of life theory at hydrothermal vents. And his first papers came out in about 1994. So this is the first paper, which you can get down on the internet, by those people who discovered the hydrothermal vents: Corliss, Barros, and Hoffman. And this is the first paper in which they related these submarine hot springs, as they call them, now we call them hydrothermal vents, with the origin of life. And they write, these systems are characterized by high fluxes of thermal energy, highly reducing conditions, abundant and appropriate catalytic surfaces with the different metals. So they are assuming this Fischer-Tropsch type of synthesis of hydrocarbons or organic molecules, invoking high pressures, high temperatures, and also metal surfaces. In fact, that is how many of the organic molecules which are produced today are synthesized laboratory or in the companies.
I have a question.
Sure.
What are what submarine hot springs in español? What does it mean? Submarine hot springs.
A ver, en español usted es mejor que yo, pero creo que pudieras interpretarlo como ventos calientes submarinos, más o menos.
Okay.
Hoy en día lo llaman hydrothermal vents.
Como esas cosas que de repente explotan. Bueno, como sacan agua caliente.
Ahorita lo voy a describirlos en detalle.
Okay.
Para que ya entendamos exactamente qué es. Okay.
Gracias.
Okay. So, these are the people who discovered these hydrothermal vents, and they wrote the first paper relating the hydrothermal vents with the origin of life. But it was really this person, Michael Russell, who developed the theory. Michael Russell was a geologist who had a lot of knowledge of chemistry. He has a lot of knowledge of chemistry. He's still alive. And in fact, I was talking to him. We were corresponding, which you're going to see at the end of this talk, his correspondence with me about my theory and about his theory. So he was the one who really developed the theory. And again, they're basing it on this redox, the reduction and oxidation. So the possibility of these, for example, sulfides, metal sulfides, to act as electron donors to foment the chemical reactions which are occurring in these organics. So let's go into a little bit then about the hydrothermal vents. What are they and how do they arise? Well, they arise because the Earth, as you know, is warm or hot. As you go deeper, it gets hotter. And why is the Earth hot or warm on the interior? Because there's still a lot of radioactivity. So the decay, the radioactive decay, eventually gets dissipated into heat. That's another form of dissipation. And that causes that we have convection currents in the mantle. So these are very hot and compressed rocks, which can actually flow because of the pressure and the heat. And so we have these types of convection currents, which are like the Barnard cells. And they are causing that in the mid-ocean, that there's these what are known as ridges. So these forms in which the hot material from the mantle comes up through the crust and comes out into the ocean. And this material is causing the movement of the plates. So as you can see, for example, plate 2 here on the right, when it gets to the continents, it becomes subducted under the continents. And that is what is causing, of course, the earthquakes and the volcanoes on the continents. But in these mid-ocean ridges, we have magma coming up within the crust, very close to the surface, and water which is being drawn down through the ocean into these mid-ocean ridges, and then being heated and then spewed out again, but containing a lot of minerals and metals. So this is the basic idea explaining these mid-ocean ridges and the movement of the plates. So this is the force which is driving the movements of the plates. It can actually then be related to the radioactivity inside the Earth. So this is an example here on the left is a picture of an actual hydrothermal vent, which is known as a black smoker. There are two categories. Some are known as black smokers and others are known as lost cities. Basically the difference, well, there must be many other differences, but the basic difference is the temperature of the water which is coming out of these. So for example, in the black smokers, we have 100 to about 300 degrees centigrade okay? And that's at an ocean temperature at those depths of about between 2 and 4 degrees centigrade. And it could be if we're below like 5 kilometers of water, which are some of these ocean ridges, we're at pressures of about 1,000 atmospheres, so extremely high pressures. And the diagram in the center then is schematic of what is happening. So the water is coming in from the edges or around the sides and being heated because of the magma, and then being spewed out, carrying all these minerals, which it is taken from the crust. And as I mentioned, the pHs can be low, for example, 6.5, which is the ocean water pH, to maybe 9, 10, or even 11, when you get very close to these smokers. And the other type is the lost city, but these have lower temperature, about 75 degrees centigrade. But around this, you can also find archaea, which are living off them. In fact, the black smokers also have a lot of animal life. For example, they mentioned it in this photo here on the left, that the rugosity or the roughness of these structures is because of worms. So microscopic worms, which are actually living at these temperatures, well, not 300 degrees, but close to 100 degrees centigrade, and surviving. And it was thought for a long time that, in fact, these ecosystems, because we do find a lot of different animals at these depths, and these are some of the animals. Shrimps that don't have eyes, for instance, these are depths in which there's no light arriving. The only light would be the infrared light coming off the hydrothermal vents. So it was originally thought that perhaps what's happening and what is allowing these animals to survive is that there is an ecosystem based on some kind of photosynthetic bacteria, which was using the infrared light from the vents for its production of these carbohydrates, and that other animals then could, as it is in normal ecosystems, could survive off these bacteria and form a whole ecosystem. But now what is generally believed is that most of the food, or let's say the substance for keeping these ecosystems going, is not the infrared light coming off these hydrothermal vents, but in fact the rain of organic material, dead organic material, which is raining down from the surface. So we have all the other life which is dependent on light higher up. And when it dies, the material gets dispersed and it generally settles towards the bottom. So it was once thought it was based on infrared light, but now we know, in fact, that infrared light provides very little, if any, free energy for the functioning of these ecosystems at these depths. Now, it's interesting that if one does an analysis of the genomes of different species, and here we have the 3 domains of life, the bacteria, archaea, and the eukaryote, and we look at their ribosomal DNA. Remember, the ribosomes are those little factories in every cell which are producing the proteins. And they do that by taking the information from the messenger RNA and associating with a code an amino acid, and it builds up these segments of amino acids, and that forms the proteins. So there's a code involved in these ribosomes, the code between the codons, which are the 3 base pairs in the RNA or DNA, which are associated with a particular amino acid. So you can imagine that there cannot be much mutation in these ribosomal DNA or RNAs, because if there is, then the coding will be thrown out. And if you just change very slightly a protein, we know from mutations which happen in everyday life that that causes a lot of problem to the organism, and usually the organism doesn't survive. So these ribosomal RNAs are then very stable over time. That is, they mutate very slowly, but they do mutate. Mutations usually are not dangerous, those which do occur. And so by comparing the ribosomal DNA of these, or RNA of these different organisms, we can construct this, what's known as the phylogenetic tree of life, to see how all of these organisms are related. And it turns out from their studies that those at the base of this tree, that is the last common universal ancestor, or last universal common ancestor, LUCA, it's called, was hyperthermophilic, which means it liked very hot waters. And by hyper, we mean water between 80 and 121 degrees centigrade. So this fact is good for both our theory and for the hydrothermal vent theory, which is predicting that life started at high temperatures. So this is some evidence that our theories are plausible. Okay, now I'm going to present some of the problems with the hydrothermal vent hypothesis of the origin of life. The first one is that there are few or spatially reduced regions where vents could have occurred. So these are only at these mid-ocean ridges where these vents can occur. And they're usually very isolated. That is, they don't occupy a very large area. So compared to the whole of the ocean surface, the whole Earth ocean surface, it's a very, very small region. Secondly, the free energy available in these volcanoes, or if you like, these the energy which is coming out of the Earth's interior, is only very a small portion of that in sunlight. And we'll see how small in a future slide. And because of the hot temperatures, in fact, most of the hydrothermal vents have temperatures too high, which would cause destruction of these organics. And in fact, this was basically the criticism that Stanley Miller, who proposed that the origin of life started to the atmospheric production of these fundamental molecules of life. He criticized the hydrothermal vent hypothesis when it came out, starting in the 1980s. Because he showed or did a calculation that every 10 million years, all of the water would have been recycled through these hydrothermal vents. So all of the water would have to pass through these very hot hydrothermal vents, which would have destroyed any organic material. So he called them regions of molecular destruction and not regions of molecular synthesis. Also, now they have done a lot of experiments using systems with high pressure and high temperatures, simulating what the environment would be at these hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the oceans, trying to produce organic material, and really they have produced very little, some hydrocarbons and carbohydrates. But they haven't, for example, produced adenine, guanine, cytosine, the nucleobases, or the amino acids. Some amino acids they have produced, but very few, or the lipids, for example. So the resulting experimental data is very poor in favor of the hydrothermal vent hypothesis. Now, there's also a fact, which I'm going to emphasize later in this talk, that the fundamental molecules of life have very unique photochemical characteristics, as we have seen. They absorb very strongly in the UVC, and they dissipate this light extremely fast. And these characteristics would be very hard to explain if life started at the bottom of the oceans where there is no light at all, not even visible light arriving at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, and the further point I want to make is that photosynthesis arose very quickly after the origin of life. We'll see it probably took less than about 50 million years after the origin of life to have photosynthesis, not oxygenic photosynthesis, which would have used water as the electron donor, but a hydrogen sulfide type of photosynthesis, which still today use some of the anaerobic bacteria. And this, it turns out, arose very quickly on Earth. So it would be hard to imagine how, if life started at the bottom of the ocean where there was no light, that we could all of a sudden very quickly get photosynthesis starting up. We'll talk more about that in the future slides. So I will go through each one of these points in more detail now. And if you have any questions, you can stop me again, please, and ask. So the first point against the hydrothermal vent theory of the origin of life is that there are very few, and these are spatially reduced regions where these vents can occur. So these are the little dots here in yellow. If they're yellow or green, I can't really distinguish the difference because I'm colorblind, but these little tiny dots here are where these mid-ocean ridges occur and where these hydrothermal vents would be occurring. The first hydrothermal vents were discovered in the East Pacific Rise here. That's on the very left of the diagram here. But you can see there are very reduced spots in comparison to the ocean at large. And of course, the spot as painted on this picture is much greater than it would be in reality when we get down to surface level. And the second point against the hydrothermal vent theory is that the energy available in volcanoes, or coming from the interior of the Earth, the heat in the interior of the Earth, is very small compared to that of the free energy available in sunlight. So here I've provided a comparison of the available free energy in kilojoules per meter squared per year at the origin of life for the different forms of energy, free energy. So, and some of this is based on the work of Miller. You can find the references. I'm sorry that I haven't included them here, but you can find the references in my book, The Thermodynamic Dissipation Theory for the Origin and Evolution of Life. But we can see, for example, the solar radiation for wavelengths greater than about 300 nanometers. It's about 2.6 times 10 to the 6 kilojoules per meter squared per year. Now, the solar radiation of interest to us, which is in this long wavelength UVC range, about 230 to 280